So what is it that we can heal within ourselves through, a lot of times it's through acceptance of what is, right? Like really truly embracing that darkness has a role and that there is a purpose for yin yang, and really just focusing as much as possible on self-love and acceptance. And I think that that's where sacred geometry can kind of bridge the gap of understanding that we're emanating the geometry at all times.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Sivana family. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for all the love you give the show. Remember that your ratings and reviews here on iTunes mean everything to me. Today, we're talking to Angelina Samadhi on a topic that I'm so excited to share with you because I've been curious about it myself for years. Today, we're going to be learning all about sacred geometry, what it is, and why it aligns us with the essence of who we are. We're going to understand with Angelina sacred geometry's most famous symbols, the Sri Yantra, the flower of life, and Metatron's cube, and why we might want to hang and meditate on these images in our home. We're going to discover how sacred geometry and sound are intrinsically interconnected, something I didn't know. And of course, we end with tons of practical tips on how you can use sacred geometry throughout your yoga practice and daily life, whether it's how you choose to speak or see the world when you're walking in nature. With me today is Angelina Samadhi. As I mentioned, she's the owner and designer of Skybox Creative, a graphics company that focuses on sacred art and graphic design bundles. Her spiritual path, her journey has taken her all around the world, and she's now a designer, writer, healer, and coach. Angelina, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know we're going to talk everything sacred geometry, what it is, how it can improve our daily lives. But I know you wanted to share your story with me and the listeners first, because you like to say that sacred geometry found you, not that you found it. Can you tell us about that?
So about 4 years ago, I was running an ad agency and I was really unhappy. I had been running the company for 7 years and just couldn't do it anymore. And I woke up one morning and asked myself, what would I do if money were no object? And I decided to shut the company down, travel the world, and study film. When I got back, I was completely out of money and in debt from all of this film equipment I had bought, and realized that I don't even want to be in the film industry. So I didn't know what I was going to do. And through a synchronistic conversation, a friend of mine encouraged me to look into selling digital products. And the first product that I launched was actually a sacred geometry product. And at the time, the funny thing is, I didn't know what it was. I just had seen it before, did a little bit of research, and recreated these symbols I had seen. And what happened was it took off. I had all these other products and they weren't selling. The sacred geometry one just kept selling. So I did another set and it did really well. So then I ended up doing a bundle. And just before I knew it, thousands of people around the world had purchased my products. People were asking me, what do these symbols mean? What is this all about? And it really put me into research mode.
Tell me about this product. Like what was in it? I'm like visualizing, I download something and what is it? It's like art or it's pictures of different shapes or what?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm an illustrator and designer. So I create sacred geometry illustrations. And my vision was to take these basic geometric symbols and make them look like constellations. So I kind of created a new style of sacred geometry and launched it, and people fell in love with it. And it just totally took off.
And as an artist at that time, did you know what you were making was sacred geometry? Were you even calling it that, or you just thought these shapes were cool?
I knew that it was called sacred geometry, but I hadn't done the background research on it. I had just known that they were beautiful. And so I just started making them, literally not knowing what they were. And it wasn't until people started asking me more and more details about what they mean that I started to do my own research. And now 4 years later, here I am. And it's such a huge part of my life. Not only do I teach it, I'm creating products around it all of the time. It's what supports me full time. My husband, I ended up meeting him within this time frame. He is more into sacred geometry than anyone I've ever met. I've had mentors come into my life like Nassim Haramein, Jonathan Quinton. These are like the sacred geometry experts of the world. And it's like as if geometry took me by the hands and was like, here, let me show you what you need to know.
So I want more detail here of how someone goes from like busy ad executive or running their own ad company. And at that time, were you doing yoga? Did you have a spiritual practice, or did that all come when you started doing these travels around the world?
It was beforehand, and that was really what prompted me to shut it all down, because it was at odds. This lifestyle that I had created wasn't supporting my spiritual path, and I felt like I didn't have the time that I needed to do my meditation and my yoga. Even though I was doing it, I just felt pulled in two completely different directions. And when I traveled, I did go to Bali and did a lot of yoga, and it really helped to center me. And then what was interesting was when I got back, studying the film industry just showed me that it would have been even more out of balance. And so I just had to keep following my heart and keep following my intuition. And with each leap, I was so terrified, to be honest with you. I didn't know how I was going to make ends meet. I was so used to the security I had built and so attached to this identity that I had built up. And I just had to really just keep letting it go and just recreating myself. And it just kept getting better and better.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of times people make some huge life change, right? Like quitting their day job or something like that. And then it's this pressure that, whatever you do next needs to be the thing. And, you were pursuing film and that wasn't the thing either. It's often just a much more meandering path. And I definitely can relate to that. I'm sure people listening can too. So you start selling some online products related to, it sounds like, film and art, but it's this one product around these drawings, these sacred geometry drawings that really take off. So tell us more now, like, what is sacred geometry?
So sacred geometry, I'll start this way. So the beginning of creation, we call it the Big Bang. In spiritual traditions, oftentimes they say that the beginning was created with sound, which is Om. And even in, the Bible and other religions, they say that in the beginning was the word. And so what we know now through science and the instruments we can measure with now, that everything is vibration. Everything, in fact, is sound. And so sacred geometry and sound are inseparable. And so just as Om has the meaning that all things emanated from the same source, geometry paints the same picture for us, but with a lot more detail. So not only is everything connected through these mathematical principles, but they're repeated over and over again throughout all of nature. So we can see how everything is truly connected when we start to study more and more about these geometric equations. And even looking at sacred geometry and meditating on sacred geometry can help to strengthen the right and left hemispheres of the brain, that they can start to communicate better once the sacred geometry is integrated. So essentially it's a language, it's the language of the universe. It's a language in and of itself. And the more that we understand vibration, the more that it helps us understand the importance of geometry and why it's important to study it.
What you're saying is really interesting. Tell me more about how everything is vibration, everything is sound. Because when I think of sacred geometry, I think of a picture. Even if it's a 2D picture or a 3D picture in my mind, like a cube or, something fancy like that, I still don't understand, how is that vibration? How is that sound? Walk me through that.
Yes. And I'll do my best to explain this. As it's a visual medium, it doesn't always translate. But so essentially when you have the circle, right? So the Vesica Piscis eye is one of the first and most fundamental shapes of sacred geometry, which is the two circles overlapping that come together. And what those two circles represent is energy. And so it's the two different levels of duality that come together that form the eye so that creation can see itself. And so that's the first level of creation. And as that shape becomes a little bit more complex, you get the seed of life. And the seed of life can also be associated with the chakras and also the 7 days of creation. So there's a lot of different meanings that are applied to each individual symbol. But so once the seed of life starts to increase in complexity and energy, and there's more of this kind of how do I explain this? It's like the levels of duality. So if you think of the code of a computer where it's like a 0 and a 1 and a 0 and a 1, you have to have the negative and the positive. So all of creation is fundamentally the same way. And so it is a code. And those two circles are representing dark and light. And so as those get more complex, then you get the flower of life. And the flower of life is actually how the embryo starts. So not only is it the way that a human life begins, but it's also the way that a flower is formed. And we can see this pattern repeated throughout nature. So they say that this flower of life actually contains all of the basic information of all living things, including the energetic formula of the atom itself. So this symbol was engraved on pyramids thousands and thousands of years ago. This information is ancient, and we've known this, but it's been suppressed and it hasn't been shared with the general public. And I think the challenging thing about geometry and understanding it from a spiritual perspective is that it's been so dumbed down that when we learned it in high school or in, grade school, they were just teaching us this is a circle. So we have a concept of what a circle is instead of what a circle actually is. So once we understand a little bit deeper that the circle is the representation of spiritual energy, and then when you see a square, for example, in sacred geometry, that's actually the foundation of physical structure. That's when we can start to understand it a little bit better. So we have to kind of erase a lot of what we've learned about what shapes are, what color is, in order to fully comprehend vibration.
This is fascinating. So we've talked about the circle as being
spiritual energy.
Spiritual energy. Okay. And then you said the square is more like matter. What about a triangle?
So with the triangle, we have three. So you have the Holy Trinity, which is essentially mind, body, spirit. And if you look at the Merkaba, for example, which is one triangle upside down and one triangle right side up, it's actually showing the merging of spiritual energy and the earthly energy, if you will. And so these symbols are very complex. And Jonathan Quinton, who's one of my mentors, he's been studying sacred geometry for over 30 years. And he tells me there's still so much to learn. So me being on the path only 4 years, I do still have a lot to learn. And because of my basic understanding of it, it does change the way that I see reality and perceive everything that I see.
So let's talk about those two triangles interlocking. And just for listeners to visualize, that's also called, or that's the Star of David, right? The triangle that's facing up and the triangle that's facing down interlocked, right? And then that's also, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the yantra or the visualization that goes with the fourth chakra, which is the sort of midpoint chakra that unites the lower and upper energies, correct? So I think it would be great if you could walk us through, because I think many of us know this idea of yantras, especially when it comes to the chakras, right? Like, and I know people say different yantras for different chakras. It's actually very hard in my teacher training because there's so many different sources of truth. But, like the root chakra is a golden square, or let's say that fourth chakra, that heart chakra is that Star of David shape that we mentioned before. How did these shapes get connected with these energy centers? And then what is a yantra? Is that even the right word that I'm using to describe?
Yes. So the square at the base, as we mentioned earlier, the square is the representation of earthly energy, right? And so that's why this is our grounding root chakra. So they associated these symbols with these specific chakras because of their meaning and this foundation. And so yantra is actually where you have the square, but it has those little extra side pieces. And the yantras were created as very complex pieces of art, and they would do it as a spiritual practice. And so like in Tibet, I think it was, they would use the sand and they would just create these elaborate yantras for like weeks. And then they would just blow it all away. Because the act of recreating the yantra and these levels and dimensions of reality were helping people to actually access that energy and information. So back to the heart chakra, if you've ever seen a torus field of energy, basically it's like a big donut. And so our spine acts as the middle part of that donut, and then it goes up out through the crown chakra and back down, around, and up the base chakra. So that's how the human body works. We have this energetic vibration that's going through the spine, which is why the chakras are so important, up out of the crown and then back around. So we can actually re-channel our own energy through, which is how we heal our bodies, which is how the breath works to keep us alive. And so if you picture, if your crown chakra was open, this energy would be coming down into the center point, which would be your heart. And same with the earth energy. So you can pull the earth energy up from the wide base and then have it narrowing in. And that's where those triangles are created. So these symbols are representation of energy. And so whenever you see the circle, the triangle, the square, it's actually a representation of vibration.
That's cool, and it makes sense. And then we see these shapes, I think was what you were saying, like repeated in nature. For example, I know with tantric philosophy, right, like that splitting of the egg in embryonic development, right? Those are like circles, right? Like you see the cells split away from each other. So that's like circle creation. And I can't think of an example with square, but I'm sure there is one where it's like we see those patterns repeat in nature, affirming that same principle or theme. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, exactly. And so, if you look at gemstones, there are actually some, these little squares that come out of the ground that are perfect squares. So we'll see these shapes in nature, whether it's the perfect circle, perfect square, perfect triangle, but oftentimes there's a variance and what we see with plants and what we see with animals in the human body. So within this perfect code, within this perfect geometry, the creator had to make some variance. And so that's where the number 7 comes in. And I can't go too much into detail on that because I don't fully know how to explain it, but it basically creates the opportunity for enough diversity that we have this beautiful array of contrast and diversity within the animal kingdom and within humanity.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's like we're all basically made up of the same stuff as humans, water and blood and all that, but there's this unique variance that makes us all special snowflakes and have different personalities, and we see that reflected in nature too. So I can follow there. I think if you're open, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the chakras. And before I do, my understanding from what you said was that this idea of a yantra is just these shapes, but often we see them depicted, as you said, they're just like more ornate, like artwork has been added on. Like you might have like a triangle in a square, and then there's, I don't know how to describe it. It is hard, like decorations going on outside the square, like little shapes and things that make it more ornate, basically.
Yeah. And so I'll tell you how I've come to understand the yantras. So when we look at the Sri Yantra, we have these layers of triangles that are overlapping one another. And then we have this square outer frame. And then on each side of the square in the middle, we have these other parts that project outwards. Now, from what I've learned, those are the representation of the 4 corners. So we have the east, west, north, and south. And that's why within a lot of spiritual traditions and religious traditions, they'll bless the 4 corners of the room. They'll bless the 4 corners before ceremony. And this is what I also believe is the foundation for the way that they set up the pyramids in Egypt and around the world. So they actually put the corners, the 4 corners, aligned to the directions, the 4 directions of our planet. And the way that the pyramid comes up to the center is actually harnessing the energy in a way that you could not harness the energy otherwise on planet Earth. And so it's said that in the king's chamber, which most people can never go to the pyramids because they're off limits, but the king's chamber is about a third of the way up inside the pyramid. And they say that if you sit inside a pyramid and meditate, that you can have a transcendental experience in a much quicker time because of the way that the energy is spiraling through from the earth up through your own chakra system and up through the top of the pyramid. And so I think that the yantra is really a representation of these 4 directions and having a better understanding of the importance of all of the different corners.
I love the example you gave of the pyramids because it made me think of other places or spaces where the energy is really amazing. Like, have you ever been or heard about, like, in Sedona, Arizona, they talk about the vortex, right? Or so how does that tie into all of that? Is that just like a natural place in the geography of the world where the energy is particularly special? And is that related to the geometry?
Everything is related to the geometry. So yes. And the beautiful thing about what you mentioned is spirals. So geometry is always spiraling in and out of existence. And I like to think of it this way. So we think of sound and we think of sound waves, and we can look at a sound wave depicted on a computer, let's say, and we see these kind of zigzag lines. That's actually a two-dimensional version of what the sound wave actually looks like. So that sound wave is actually spiraling through space, and it's going up and down, and the spiral is actually increasing and decreasing in size. And so when you see the trees spiraled in Sedona, that's actually the Earth's energy emanating a certain vibration. And we could call it music, right? So it's almost like the music of the Earth. And the reason that we can feel it if we're sensitive beings when we go to a place like that is because it's actually happening, right? There's actually a spiraling energy coming up out of the Earth, and we can absorb it through our chakra system and through our bodies, but we do have to be open, because part of the spiritual practice and process is us being open.
I really like how you describe that. I think I had a little bit of an aha moment where it's sound, which, you know, right now recording this podcast, I'm looking at the sound on my computer. It's just an up and down line, right? But energetically, it's vibration. And of course, as a yogi, right? Like, I know that. I chant Om. I do a lot of chanting in my practice, but I'm visualizing what you say now as like the sound almost has its own geometric shape as it like travels through the air in a spiral. Am I kind of like visualizing that right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's reverberating all throughout space-time. So it doesn't stop at the edge of our planet either, right? And this is why our energy, our emotions, our words are literally creating so much more than we realize, because it's going far beyond what our human mind can even comprehend. But this vibration, this spiral that we're emanating, it goes forever.
So we could talk a lot about language, but I want to keep us, and if you have something you want to share about that, please do, because I really appreciate what you're saying, you know, about our words having an energetic frequency. I think as yogis and, you know, people on the spiritual path, like we really can relate to that. So if you have something you want to share on that, I want you to. However, I want to keep talking about shapes and geometry, because I know that's your specialty. But is there something you wanted to add on the sound piece or the vibration piece that connects this?
I think it is important. Yeah, I would like to add a little bit, because basically knowing that all of reality, all of what we consider to be solid is a vibration. And so within that, we know that it's also holographic. And when we understand the geometric codes and we start to look into like the golden ratio and some of these patterns that are repeated throughout so many different aspects of nature, we can see that we are essentially a fractalized version of the whole. And in knowing that, we can know that whatever's happening on the inside is going to be reflected on the outside. So I call it the mirror world, or our mirror reality. And so whatever the vibration is that's happening inside, you know, the first level of creation is thought, and then the next level of creation is word, and then action. But all of this has a geometric code. All of this has this mathematical equation emanating from us at all times. And so knowing that, we can take into, I was going to say control, but we can start to actually monitor what are our thought patterns. You know, when are we in judgment? How much are we accepting of the darkness and the light within not only ourselves, but the planet? And I think that that's where the true healing can occur. And I think that that's why sacred geometry is so beautiful, is because if we truly understand it, that it's just a repeating pattern throughout all of the cosmos, that we are so much more powerful than we realize. And we have an effect on everything. So, you know, if we're looking at politics or we're looking at the tragedies and things that are happening in the world, we can remember that it's actually starting inside of us too, that it still lives inside of us, or else it wouldn't be external. So what is it that we can heal within ourselves through? A lot of times it's through acceptance of what is, right? Like really truly embracing that darkness has a role and that there is a purpose for yin yang, and really just focusing as much as possible on self-love and acceptance. And I think that that's where sacred geometry can kind of bridge the gap of understanding that we're emanating the geometry at all times.
Yeah, this is a perfect segue for what I wanted to ask you about next, because I think many of us, or at least me, you know, the idea of meditating on a shape or on a yantra that I know goes with, you know, the chakras, or, you know, just as a starting point is something that I'm interested in. But I want to know, like, how can working with these shapes heal us and change our energy? Like, let's get practical, right? Like, if I come to sit, what is the benefit of me meditating on a red square, for example, which we could say might ground my energy? But at a deeper level, not just like the chakra yantras, but like what you're saying, that it bridges this gap, that it helps connect us with the world around us and heals us somehow. Like, how can we use geometry in our meditation or daily life to do that?
Well, I think it's like this. The geometry is the mathematical code of all things. We are, in essence, the creator of all things. We have just temporarily forgotten. And so the Vesica Piscis eye, it shows us that the whole design is for the eye to see itself.
And tell us what that shape is, just so people can visualize it as they listen to you.
Yeah, so it's the two circles overlapping that create the shape of the eye. And so that tells us, and I've had my own awakening experiences where I've actually felt this deeply, that the eye was created to see itself. And so within that, we are God. Like, we are made, you know, they say in Christianity, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And so this is true. And so if we can tap into the energy of who we truly are, the geometries of the chakras or any other geometries, whether it's flower of life, Metatron's cube, we can remember who we are, because it is a language, and we've just temporarily forgotten, but we forgot on purpose. And so this was what I had my own revelation when I had my awakening experience, was that we forgot. And it was so clear to me in this moment that it was all part of the design, and all of this human suffering that we go through and all of these things was just to essentially play the game, to come into a level of duality and be able to experience life as it is. And so the way I see it is, when we're meditating on these chakras or these colors or these symbols, that it's aligning us to the truth of the vibration of that area within our body. And we've just forgotten how powerful the spinal column actually is. So if we learn to work with the breath in conjunction with these symbols and colors, we can activate our bodies and truly turn on gifts and powers that we never thought possible. You know, and we hear about these things happening in ancient Tibet, or, you know, these people who, I don't know if you've ever heard of rainbow light body, but people who would literally disappear. And so, you know, we think of like, is this really possible? You know, can people really heal cancer in a second? And the answer is yes. How are they doing that? Right? So it's actually tapping into this vessel, or this machine almost, that we have been given, that feels, you know, so human. Like, we've just been taught so many things that are incorrect about who and what we are, that it's hard for us to activate unless we tap into the truth. And so when you have color or you have shape, there's no other information that can cloud your judgment or kind of suppress this truth of vibration.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is that these shapes, as we meditate on them, we realize that they're within us and also reflected in the cosmos around us. And it reminds us of that we're all one, right? Like, that we all come from that, whether you want to call it like Brahman or universal intelligence or that big bang, that we are so powerful. What would you tell someone who has a strong yoga and meditation practice? Because many of our listeners do, right? And they're like, I want to integrate this into my practice. Now, things I've seen, right? And I really appreciate how deep you're going with us, because I think people sometimes talk about sacred geometry, or you can keep it a little bit like superficial. So, but what, like, things I've seen, people do those like coloring books, right? Of shapes. I've seen people, of course, work with the different shapes and colors that go with the chakras. I've seen people hang pictures of, like what you said, very powerful symbols in their home, and maybe do they look at those with their eyes open when they meditate? Like, do they focus on nature and notice the shapes in trees and things around us? Like, if someone wants to go deeper with all this, like, what do you tell them? Are you telling them, like, get a coloring book, get a card deck, do chakra, you know, all of the above? Like, what is your advice?
I would say all of the things you mentioned are great. And part of what we need to do in this life, regardless what we're studying, is to feel what gravitates the most to us. So putting geometry in your home is definitely important. And if you do meditate on geometry, let's just say you're sitting on your couch and you have a big flower of life on the wall. If you stare at it, you'll start to see things within that shape that you've never seen before. So you won't just see all of these circles overlapping each other, but you actually start to see patterns coming out of it, and they start changing and they start morphing. And same thing with the Metatron's cube. We used to have this large sticker on this big window that overlooked the ocean, and I would just stare at it and it would keep changing. I would see the square pattern formations. I would see all of these things that are like coming out of the symbol. So meditating on them with your eyes open is great. And I think that over time, depending on the person and how visual you are, eventually, once you close your eyes, you'll start to see geometry. And I've heard that the way that the levels of creation work is there's kind of this God force energy, and the next level below that is geometry. And the next level below that are like the deities and the ascended masters and angels. And so geometry is like the closest thing that we can see to source. And so, having it around your home, going out into nature, it's the same thing. It's still geometry. So especially if you have the opportunity to be in nature, be by yourself in a meditative state, really just having this relationship with a flower and seeing what kind of information comes back to you is essentially the same thing. So I think that, everyone has a different personality, and one thing might work for someone and something else works for another person. And so feeling your way through it and maybe testing some things out as well and seeing really what resonates the most with you.
Because we have you, so I want to ask you, what are the 3, in your opinion, most powerful or transformational shapes we could hang in our home? Because you've mentioned a couple quickly as we've gone through, but maybe you can break them down and just describe them for us so we can visualize them a little bit. So like circle of life sounds like it's a great one, and that's just all interlocking circles, right?
It's a flower of life.
Flower of life. Thank you.
No worries. And that's the one that has several layers of circles overlapping each other. That one is one of my favorites. And it is the one that was engraved on the pyramids. They say that it contains all the basic information of all living things. So that's a really powerful symbol to have around you or on you. Right. So even having a shirt with it or a necklace with a pendant, it's a powerful symbol, and it vibrates even if you're not looking at it. Another one is the Sri Yantra. And for me, I love that symbol. It actually translates to an instrument of wealth. And so having that around or meditating on that symbol can bring in more financial abundance. So we all love that. So we have a lot of those around our house.
And describe that one for listeners too. That's sort of like triangles within a circle within a square. Is that right?
Yeah. Multiple triangles overlapping. Yep. So it's kind of like the Star of David, but with more levels of triangles. And Metatron's cube, I think that would be the other one, which is the base is the Star of David, and then it has the circles around the points. And that one represents, I've seen it in a presentation once by David Wilcock, and he said that was the actual vibrational emanation of the atom. So it's a very powerful symbol, and it's also really highly connected with the shape of the human body.
So that's great. I'm already like looking at some walls in my house being like, okay, where do I want to put what? Or, I love the idea of the jewelry too is really nice. When you're out walking in nature, what is it? Is there something, because I think a lot of people want to tap into this, but maybe they're not really sure like how or what they're looking for. So when you, for example, go out and walk in nature and you're looking at trees or the river or stones, what common patterns are you seeing, or what hints would you give people who want to kind of see this deeper level of geometry that's happening around us?
Probably the easiest way would be to look for the Fibonacci sequence. And if you're unfamiliar, it's Google search away. So cactuses will sometimes have that formation, sunflowers. You can definitely see it in some of nature really clearly. But then you have trees where it's following different geometric patterns. So that's more of the branching effect, which you'll see also repeated throughout nature in rivers. At the veins of the rivers that flow through the earth actually look the same as the branches of the tree. And so and same with the, neurons in the brain and all of this stuff. So there's multiple places that these things show up in repeating patterns.
And that's kind of like a spiral, right? Or am I wrong?
Well, the Fibonacci sequence is based on the golden ratio, which is the golden spiral. So essentially, Fibonacci is a mathematical equation. It is a spiral, yes. And so the way that shows up in a flower, for example, is the spiral is rotating from the center around and around and around. And that's how you get those petals.
So looking for that in the things you're seeing out in nature, like a pine cone or a flower or a tree or a shell, that kind of thing.
Yes. And the pine cone is actually really powerful because that's said to represent our pineal gland. And I've heard it said that our pineal gland works very similarly, where it all closes up. And then once we have some kind of a meditative experience where we go into these high gamma brainwave states, it actually opens just as a pine cone does. And that's when all of these chemicals are released in the brain that allow us to have these transcendental experiences.
So this is cool. I think we have some practical tips of ways we can begin trying to see more sacred geometry around us, maybe trying to think of, even when we chant mantra like Om or Om Namo, Gurudev Namo, different things that we can try to visualize the geometry that goes with that sound as we're chanting, perhaps. Yes? Is that another technique we could maybe use at home?
Yeah. I mean, I think just remembering that everything that comes out of your mouth or anything that's emanating from your body, whether it's thought or emotion, is a vibration of geometry and is spiraling outwards. And so there's a reason these chants have been sung throughout the ages. It's because, they do have a powerful effect, and they knew the energetics of words and they knew the geometry of sound. And so just trusting, when you're studying on the yoga path that what you're chanting is healing your body and is healing the planet.
All right, this has been great. I feel like we've got a lot of practical tips. For my last question, I don't want to let you go without asking you a little bit more about sound and vibration, because I know a lot of folks and myself love like sound baths, like you were talking about, like that sound traveling. And I'm actually pregnant right now. And the last sound bath that I went to, it's like I always feel the vibration in my body, but I could really feel it in my womb. Like my baby was like, whoa, you know what I mean? Like it was like a lot for him. And how does geometry tie into like sound healing or sound baths or some of the other things that people might be exploring and doing in that realm?
Well, I would like to also share that I am pregnant with a boy too.
Oh my gosh. That's incredible.
That's pretty amazing. But to answer your question, cymatics is the study of the vibration of sound. So if anyone wants to dive a little bit deeper, I would highly recommend doing a search on that. But essentially what they did was they took a metal plate, they put a bunch of sand on it, and they started playing instruments, and they started getting different sound tones and frequencies and seeing what happened to this sand. And it started to form in these beautiful patterns. And with each tone, it was just forming more and more complex shapes that started to really mimic shapes in nature. So there was, I think it was Chladni patterns. It was this man who was studying cymatics, and he started to create shapes that looked just like a tortoise, that looked just like leopard spots. So essentially, because we know that we are vibration, even though we feel so solid, and even though we think of ourselves as these solid beings, because we're made up of sound, when we're in a sound bath, all of our cells start to vibrate differently. And so,
because we're made of water, right? Like
we're made of
water. Yeah,
exactly. And so the next level of the cymatics studies is actually water. So they were studying, how does it affect sand on this plate? And then how does it affect water? And you can see just the most beautiful patterns flowing through. And some of them, if you play certain harmonies, are very disharmonious to the body. And so, when we have a gong bath or crystal bowls being played, it's actually healing every single piece of our body. And the only thing that would prevent that would be resistance, would be our own tension. And so as long as, if you're going into a sound bath, the one thing I would recommend is just go in with an open mind and really allowing as much as possible for your body to be completely healed.
And would you advise us to visualize a certain shape, like one of the ones you mentioned, while we're experiencing the sound bath?
I think it depends on the individual, because not everyone has an easy time doing visualizations. And so sometimes it can be a distraction from your experience. when I first started meditating like 15 years ago, one of the meditations I learned was called Gateway of the Inner Body, and it had nothing to do with visualization. And still, to me, it's one of the most powerful meditations that I recommend to people. So for me, I prefer to do the eyes open meditation with the geometry itself. And when I'm going into those deeper states, I'm just allowing. And sometimes symbols come to me. So I've been in really deep, profound meditations where the Sri Yantra came to me. And actually just this past weekend, I was doing a meditation with my husband, and the star came to me, and I didn't know why. And I, sometimes I still don't know why. And so I just do more research on that symbol because I feel like it's telling me something. There's something that I'm supposed to research there or learn. So if a symbol comes to you, pay attention for sure.
And when you say do more research, are you like plugging this into Google, or I'm imagining there's like books that you'd maybe recommend to folks who want to go deeper with this? Because I know the internet's not the most reliable for some of these types of things.
Not the most reliable. And, we have a ton of books around our house. I don't know the names of all of them, but I love to learn through film. I mean, I studied film, and it's one of my passions. And so I love documentaries. One of the films I would recommend is called Inner Outer Worlds, and Black Hole is another one, but spelled WHOLE. And that one is by Nassim Haramein. I think you can get it on Gaia. And those two are pretty good foundational movies to just give you like a broad understanding of all of this. And then I think, if there's a certain symbol that calls to you, there are actually great videos on YouTube. There are tons of books. There's a Flower of Life book series, which is great. So yeah, I mean, there's infinite amount of resources these days on this topic.
No, I think it's great. I think sharing the two films and the book is a great way just for people to know where to go next if they're like, I need more of this. And then can you tell listeners how they can get more of you? How can they connect with you and find you online or purchase your artwork or get more involved in everything you're doing?
Sure. So Angelina-Samadhi.com is my personal website. I do not only sell sacred geometry artwork, I also do coaching and soul guidance for people. So I offer individual sessions, which can be found there. And if any of the listeners are designers and know how to work with vector files, I have a huge shop on skyboxcreative.com, and you can find chakra illustrations. I have like 7 different sets of sacred geometry. So anything that you need to create design work for your business or your personal brand can be found there.
Fantastic. I'm definitely going to check that out myself. Angelina, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And listeners, let me know what you thought of today's interview. You know where you can join the conversation. Just go over to savannahEast.com/group. That's going to redirect you to our private Facebook group. And I'd love it if you would leave a comment or review here on iTunes. Even if iTunes isn't where you normally listen to the show, leaving a review on iTunes helps get the show in front of more people looking to improve their life through yoga and meditation. So I'd so appreciate getting your feedback. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the very, very end. I hope you look at the world today with some new eyes, maybe see some patterns and shapes that you didn't see before. I'm sending you so much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana Podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at SivanaEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode. And thank you for listening to the Sivana Podcast.